Well, Akin, it's a great pleasure for me that you accepted to spend a few minutes with me. You are the vice president of the International Geographical Union of this Congress, and I understand there is great pressure on you. But anyway, I would like to ask you a few questions which are related to the issues you touched upon in your excellent presidential address. I think it was very good of you to use this occasion when we have people from both all sides of the world, yeah, to say a few things. But at the same time, I came to think about a sentence somebody uttered, I don't remember who said, there are times when events are too big for man. When one listens to the list of problems we have in the world today, particularly the development problems, one gets the feeling that the situation seems nearly hopeless. But that's not a fruitful attitude to have. So I would like to hear a little more about what you think about these matters, and particularly what is your experience about development in your own country.
Well, I must thank you for, first of all, for asking me to spend a few minutes sharing my thoughts on some of the major issues confronting mankind, if one might say so, but particularly man in developing countries. And also I must thank you for referring to my presidential address. I hope I made the point in that address that one fact which we can no longer ignore, even though we've been using the terms and we might in fact forget some of its implication, is that of global interdependence. We use it sometimes simply to mean people getting in touch with each other, but I was hoping in my address that I was emphasizing that if people are going to interact, there are consequential changes that are involved, both for the individual and for the group, for the world itself. And I use the word structural changes, which I expect would happen both in the developed countries and in the developing countries. Now, it seems to me we've reached the end of an era in the developing country, an era in which it was assumed that nice support from developed country, aid from developed country, ideas from developed countries could be brought together to help in changing conditions in developing countries. I believe we've come to an era where we've tried this and we've maybe succeeded in some areas, but it solved certain problems but created more serious ones and maybe allowed the real problem to emerge. For me, coming from a developing country, I find the last 30 years one in which we've been seduced by the idea of help to forget the old adage that heaven helps only those who help themselves, and that we've done less to help ourselves, and we've been put in a position in which we think our development can come by others helping us. So that when I use structural changes and the statement that we've come to the end of an era, it's in the sense that now we're all back almost to zero. To move from there in developing countries, we would have to confront our problems directly. The developed countries themselves are no longer as confident that they can help us by making us ignore that fact. And the next 2 decades, for the way I see it, are going to be decades in which we're going to see pluralities of strategies within developing countries to tackle their own problems.
But don't you see a kind of tension or contradiction between these two tendencies? On the one hand, you have more and more global interdependence,
Yeah.
and under this development, there is now obviously understood that the third world countries have to stress their own profile,
Yeah.
find their own solutions, and
Yeah.
so on. But the interdependence must, if so, take such a shape that it doesn't form a straitjacket on what you want to do. How do you feel about that?
Well, I'll not use the word contradiction. I want to use a word which I don't want to get caught in the ideological overtow, that there is a dialectic there. And it's an interesting dialectic because, again, one can use a simple analogy, but I wouldn't want to press that analogy too far. Is what happens to a father and a son around the age 13 to 16, in which the boy is starting to feel he's an adult. He can't, in fact, see too much that's different between him and his father, except that he lacks experience, he lacks sometimes the intellectual capacity of the father and so on. And you get a tension, because he has to do a lot of things the father is doing. I was never in doubt, in an intuitive way, that if developing countries start acquiring some of the style of life, not all the consumption style, but consumption, basket of goods as the developed countries, there must reach a stage there'll be tension. Some of that tension we're starting to feel at the moment, but some of the more positive implications of it in terms of how they change their own structure to make it more viable to cope with the tension, I think is what is going to come out for me in the next 2 decades. Some countries would make it. Some countries will still be a problem at the end of the 20th century, because in everything I've said, one of the most crucial factors for which I don't think science has any way of resolving that would be an enlightened leadership. Countries which succeed, which are fortunate in the next 2 decades, to get leadership that can quickly assess the situation and start moving their countries in directions to deal with the problem, would come through. At the end of 20 years, we will still have countries which would have to come through, but would have one advantage, that there would be then models of not of old developed countries, but of new countries which are developing.
But what you say, doesn't it imply that you need very strong national units, national governments, which can protect what is new and from erosion from global interests?
Okay, there are 2 issues you've raised there. Strong government and protection from global interests. And I think one can take those separately. I think myself, the strength of a government sometimes is situational, that a government becomes strong to the extent that events in countries become such that everybody appreciates that that's really just what we need. I mean, that the situation is so bad that a strong government is what is needed. Then the government can become strong, because the countries feel their situation is desperate. Now, I have a feeling we might see some of that in the countries because the idea that their economy can be transformed without serious discipline by the people themselves, serious sacrifices, serious transformation, I think that is all blown as myths now, so that it would, to my mind, be less difficult for strong governments to emerge. Of course, strong government then becomes a two-edged sword.
Oh yes, yes.
They can become strong but not go where they should go, or strong and then lead the countries in the way they should go. Now, with regard to protection, again, I have a feeling some of that is situational, in the sense that you're quite aware yourself that the literature on regional development in the 70s, we were moving towards a consensus using words like selective closure, that countries, to be able to undertake structural adjustment, may have to close their doors in a selective way. Again, I would say that some of these have become feasible as a result of the tendencies that we now see, that most countries are in dire economic straits, and even if they wanted to adopt or copy or mimic patterns of the developed world, they just find they can't afford it. And to that extent, they have to close their doors against some of these things. Now, what I don't think many countries appreciate enough is the way in which, and this may be where you have a point, the difficulty of closing the door against communication, may itself generate within each country, this, what do we call it now, the expectations that are not easy to fulfill within the country. And I'm afraid it may be that part of the consequences of the difficulties we're facing in developing countries today could be a period when there may be certain attempt to be more selective with regard to images coming through, especially images which are of a consumption, of styles of consumption, as a way of keeping down expectations within a country.
Yeah, I think by this we come close to an area which is of great interest to people in education and in research. How do you foster images of the kind which really lead to development? Have you given some thought to, for example, using comparative studies in geography as a tool of influencing people's images concerning alternatives?
Let me say that in this area, we're going to be caught with the problem of technology. The whole product cycle in technology involves a situation in which a very, what they call the high-tech product, goes through a phase in which the needs of the consumer start affecting the way you adjust the character of the product, such that eventually you get a product which doesn't need much input from the consumer to be able to consume it. Now, a lot of products which are in the image forming area, I believe many of them are still of a level of sophistication requiring infrastructure, which many of the countries I am talking about can acquire but cannot maintain. Maintenance problem, and because they will then discover that when your level of technology is not such as to enable you to invest in sophisticated equipment which you can maintain and use, that we might get the tendency to review how they use images, and the images that may become therefore more viable to some of them may have historical element to it than what is happening at the moment. Because I am still making the point that in many of the countries we're talking about, you will recognize that they have managed to acquire something of the industrial technology of the developed world, even when they can't sustain it, because it's simply a matter of bringing in factories and so on. But the changes needed to sustain it are internal to their own organization and institutions. And until they can make that change, even sustaining what they've acquired becomes difficult. And to my mind, that's why in many countries today, the crisis is coming in the rural area, in the ability to feed yourself, in the ability to mobilize your people, so that when you acquire technology, it can become an integral part of the total technological resources of the country. So what I'm saying in effect is that many developing countries, and I reckon people from developed countries who think about this matter, probably think we can jump certain intermediate stages simply because the developed world have moved so far ahead. And it is my suspicion that we may find this is an issue which needs to be given more attention than we have done. It may not mean going back to using technologies of the 19th century, but it could mean a more serious issue of how do you really adapt existing technology to the needs of population which don't have the social infrastructure as distinct from, you know, just purely mechanical or type of infrastructure.
Yeah. But let me take a very concrete example of the things which sometimes happen. In Copenhagen, there is a firm selling flowers.
Yes.
These flowers are grown down in Kenya.
Yes.
And a couple of villages in Kenya do the work.
Yes.
But they get every day the order from Copenhagen, computer-wise, what to do this day, what field to cut, and how much to send by air to Copenhagen, and so on. That's a kind of, I suppose you don't approve of that kind of arrangement.
No, but the point I wanted to use there is that, in fact, it illustrates some of what I meant, except that you've put the two ends in two different countries. Yeah. That it is, you see, what Sweden is using is not just technology, is an organizational ability linked up with where you got something from. Okay. That could easily have happened, okay, if the Swedish group moved to Kenya itself, okay. Now there are some of those things it can do, but there are some it can't do, because the infrastructure in Kenya can support the more complex network of information that comes into its own decision making to make the farm in Kenya do certain things. So what I'm saying, maybe I should explain what I mean. Kenya end is really just production. But for that to survive, there is the demand side, which is what is being coordinated. And the coordination is possible because the infrastructure, both organizational, technological, and institutional, are developed in Sweden. Okay, so to be able to perform, because I mean what Kenya is doing there is using its resources, and I'm assuming the Swedish do pay the flag. Okay. Using its resources to earn money. Okay, but it could have done that much more effectively if it had the other resources, in fact, to become a competitor to the center in Sweden. But it won't do that unless it does much more than what it is doing at the moment with flower growing, with other organizational problems, other institutional problems, and other infrastructural problems. That's the point I'm trying to make.
And that's what I mean when I say there is a contradiction here in the globalization and in development, because these people in Kenya, they don't learn very much about modern organization and modern technology in this arrangement. But it could have, from Scandinavian side, been made otherwise. So these people had both earned money and been learning about organization matters and so on.
Okay. In other words, I think you put in the question in another form from what I'm putting. What would have happened, one can pose it in two ways, if the Swedish group tried to operate from Kenya, or what would have happened if they donated the whole network, to Kenya and say, oh, we've got all the demands for you, you operate it. And I think you would find what I'm trying to say, that images that allow it to function effectively in Sweden are not there in Kenya. Kenya might probably take it and make it a parastatal of government. And then you would get what in Nigeria we call the dead hand of bureaucracy. And in 6 months, you will start getting complaints that we didn't get our flower again and so on, because the chap who is handling this within the bureaucracy doesn't fully appreciate that answering the letters immediately is a crucial part to the success of the whole apparatus. The other thing would be that, in fact, the basic infrastructure, telephoning, telexing, cables, of course, would work someday, then there would be electricity failure and it can't work and so on. And some of these, I believe, are the direction in which changes must take place. Now, I want to say again that some of these things require a country having to try its own people and believe that even with technology, you need a degree of trial and error internally to be able to move forward. At the moment, most governments will think if you want to do electricity, even small dams, you would have to go and find some Swedish companies, some German company. And although they're training their own students, the idea that the real end product of that training is when they can do that thing using, to a large extent, their own student, requires some time to take place. And it is, to my mind, the sort of crisis they are facing now that will force them increasingly to say, well, okay, let's see what we can do internally, and in that way to start changing the structure of their own economy and their own society. But it won't be at the high-tech level. It will still have to be in a number of practical, basic things needed to change the whole production structure or consumption structures and so on.
I had recently opportunity to look a little closer into the development of transportation technology. And it came out from my reading that the bicycle is an extremely essential invention for industrialization in Europe and America. And there is a direct link between the technology of the bicycle and the technology of air transportation. Because it's the same very light things they need and so on. Okay, then when I was a boy and my country was well, it was clearly industrialized, but not to the degree it is now. Everybody played with bicycles, picked them into pieces and put them together again. And this was a very fine way of educating people to become workers in industry or engineers or what have you. And this, I guess, is an example of what you have in mind, how you teach people to live with the technology. But I think you mentioned that in the developing world it is somehow difficult to now to start with a bicycle and do it all over, because that would you would feel this sort of backward way of approaching it. Would one need some similar educative technology which could do the work of the bicycle but still would be something different?
I would really simply say I see that as an option. That's why I keep saying plurality of models coming on. But the bicycle remains still an important teaching gadget for simple principles of rotary motion. Now, in a country like mine, Nigeria, the period when we had a lot of petroleum resource, petrol dollars really, we seem to have just run straight across. You know, a lot of people in the rural area, instead of bicycle, now buy motorcycle and so on, because it was easy to buy. And one might assume, therefore, that they've jumped this bicycle stage. But to run a motorcycle means, of course, you must always be sure of the availability of petrol. And when the machine breaks down, that you have people who can repair, maintain it. I'm not sure that's as widespread as it should be. Now, whether when many of those motorbicycles start collapsing, you then find some people going back to the bicycle. Some people haven't acquired skill to, deal with motorbicycles, the motor content. It's an interesting thing that I would be watching in my country. But I want to say also that I have then been in some of the Southeast Asian countries where they have moved from the bicycle as such to using that mechanism for grinding, that somebody stays on the bicycle and his rotary motion is now being used almost in the same way as the steam engine was moved into the whole locomotive sort of thing. And to me, the fact that after that rush of thinking you can become an industrial country simply because the multinational bring factories to your country, then we are about to start in a serious way learning that development consists really of ideas, concepts, which become an integral part of the thought accumulation of a people, and that the physical thing we see are simply manifestation of an inward process and not simply something that can be created by outsiders and then you can say, I am developed because I have a Coca-Cola factory or something like that.
Now, this perspective you line up here, is it just a few intellectuals who have it, or do you feel that politicians and the broader, or at least more entrepreneurial among the population, are thinking in a similar way? You complained a little about bureaucracy
Yes.
a while ago.
Yes.
Is it possible to find an understanding for this kind of perspective among the bureaucrats?
Well, let me say, these ideas, is it just among some academics and so on? Is it more widely appreciated? I think my answer would be increasingly, as people come across the wall. And I want to, in countries where the stage is being set for them to move into the phase I'm talking about. If you were to take two countries in Africa, like Chad and Nigeria, I would say Chad is still busy, even just fighting to exist as a country, that I can't claim they've even started to think about this problem. By contrast, I think Nigeria, we've reached a stage we would have to face this a set of problems. And the way I would explain this is, of course, that the recent crisis in our country in which the military intervened, which was misunderstood in the West, and I think they are understanding it now, is really for the first time because the political class messed up a whole situation in which our development process was being taken in direction which was helping just a few people. And when the new military person head made a statement, very trite and obvious statement, that this is our country, we are the only people who can develop this, is the only country that we have, and we would have to sink or swim with it. Now, that's, to my mind, so it's a trite statement, but in the context of what had happened, had a significance which I don't think an outsider can easily appreciate. But it had meant an increasing tendency to look inward, to say, for instance, agriculture. Okay, we're all going into agriculture, and in my country today, if you are a minister or a commissioner in some of the states, it is obligatory for you to have a farm, because it's becoming a problem. Now, some of the structural, serious structural adjustment, I think we would get there, but for the moment, it appears as if it's just the shortage of food that government is trying to make everybody go in and start back in agriculture. The bureaucracy, I think there's been more coming out from the academic literature at the moment, showing how important they are for development, but also how dangerous they can be as an inhibitor of the development process, because their tendency to operate by rules, by precedents, could frustrate the whole process, which depends on initiative, some degree of entrepreneurship, and so on. I believe this is still at the stage when some people in business, some in the university are saying this. How far it will start involving both the political class and the bureaucracy itself, looking at their operation, I can't forecast. But it has seemed to me up till now that their role has not been as enabling as theoretically one expects it to be.
There is one issue you talked about in your address we have not touched upon, and that's population development. As far as I understand, still in Nigeria you have a very high fertility rate. What do you think about the possibilities of having an economy catching up with this, or is it still necessary to try to introduce family planning and get a lower rate of population growth?
That's a very good question. Let me say that I'm on the population and board of trustees of the Population Council in New York, and I have watched situation in my country with regard to population over the last 10 years. In the early 70s, in fact, we even had a conference which I initiated. The thinking was that this whole question about regulating the size and the rate of growth of population in the country is a Western, particularly American, sponsored or inspired program which the country should reject. And for some time, the Nigerian press, we don't talk population. In fact, they hardly refer to it, and we're happy to be a big country in Africa. In the last 12 months, there have been articles, editorials in the newspapers, increasingly raising the issue of population as a factor in our development, that with food shortage, we better start thinking of population. Now, at this stage, it's still mainly in the media. I reckon most countries would be worried about abortion, like the United States, but the government itself is being presented with a situation where, in Nigeria at least, it would become less problematic to start introducing policies actively to help people to regulate the size of their family, because it's becoming a privilege problem that the size of the population vis-a-vis the rate at which food is being produced is something a government must look at. So I did raise the problem, but it is to say that the situation is starting to change. And this would mean that the academic highlighting of it, the policy initiative in the field may come to be more acceptable, that the country might be more receptive than it has been for a long time.
Oh, a final question.
Yeah.
What do you think we as geographers could contribute?
I think we're going to find we have to do a few things quite differently in geography. But they may be really carrying on a trend, because we're now in an area in which it's not enough simply to gather information. The past is no longer a clear guide to the future, and we have to be more inclined to try scenarios ourselves, to indicate that a future can be of this type. Some of that we would get to by a better grasp ourselves of the past in a number of countries at different stages of development. I'm trying to say within geography itself, we have not looked at the processes of change in somewhat positive terms, as distinct from, you might almost say, random models of what has happened. And we need some experience of other countries, the sort of thing we do in historical geography, not to say the past will be replicated, but that this happened in the past to bring this about. And some of that would have to be thought of if the changes, the structural changes one is talking about must come about in this country. The structural changes, as I said before, also must take place in the developed countries. Now, I have no doubt they're already thinking of scenarios of their own, and I don't want to be pretentious and say I can say what will happen, but I know the sort of work you're doing in Sweden yourself, which is to do what I'm suggesting, one would have to do in a different way in the developing countries, because they look a little more like black boxes for scholars at the moment, and they don't have enough of their own scholars to start painting that scenario. The other thing which I see that we have to do is that there is a tendency now to use all the high-level, high technology in the field of information. And we're going to be, well, okay, one uses the word already, information explosion. I believe in geography, we have enough experience that that could be just as inhibiting, having too much information and no theory, as having no information and simply describing the little things happening. Now, it seems to me that this wealth of information we're going to go through, in my mind, a new round of theory formation, concept formation, simply to make it possible to use those data effectively. But that the theories that I think are likely to come out now will become more important if their focus is not simply to explain what is, but like Losh said, you know, what could be, such that you start seeing theories in social sciences as not simply predictive theories, but theories that allow you better means of appraising trends, evaluating tendencies in countries. Now, for me, this would be an exciting time for geography. I find, for instance, that people are getting back into political geography, into geography of administration, and geography which are more concerned with actual processes that lead to changes in the life of people, not just in the, if you like, economic progress of a country, but how this affects the circumstances of living of the mass of the people. And I would think these are trends which I would hope in the future would be strengthened and which will develop. And in geography, I'm confident we have an exciting 20 years ahead of us, at least till the end of the century.
Well, this is, I think, is a good message to conclude with, and I let you go back to your duties now. Thank you for spending this time with me.
Well,
and welcome to Sweden. The doors for you are always open.
That I appreciate, and thank you very much. Thank you very much.